We've learned how to answer lots of questions about reactions, including what happens, how much of it happens, how much energy is generated when it happens, how far does it go, and how fast does it go. In this last module, we'll talk a little bit about how reactions actually take place. What is the reaction path? It turns out this is one of the most difficult questions to answer, and one which there is still much active research going on. Our learning goals for this particular lesson are to describe a reaction as a series of elementary steps. So what is a reaction mechanism? I think before I get into some definitions, I'd like to make an observation, and that is that a reaction is very much like a journey. So we can think of a mechanism as being sort of the path that we take on that journey through lots of different places, but ultimately with a certain destination, which would be the products of the reaction. Now, a net chemical reaction is basically going to be the sum of a series of reaction steps. We haven't described those steps yet, but if we start thinking of chemical reactions as being a process that takes place in several definitive steps, it will help us understand a little bit more about how we're going to frame reaction mechanisms. There are going to be some intermediates along the way, that is, chemical species that are produced during the course of a reaction, but they're not really part of the net chemical reaction. And so we're going to want to be aware of those and be able to identify them as we go along. The mechanism then is going to be a sequence of what I'll call elementary reactions, and their net sum is going to be a complex chemical reaction. You may recall that I've referred to combustion reactions several times as being very complex reactions. Indeed, it's impossible to reverse a combustion reaction because they're so complex and they go through so many different steps. And I would also say that it's been very difficult for scientists to get a handle on exactly what the sequence of steps that a combustion reaction goes through. Now, for sources of information, we're going to have the rate law, which was the subject of Module 7, and this is something that we find empirically from experimental data. There are some theories that help us to frame rate laws, but mostly we don't know a rate law until we've actually measured something experimentally and tested it against different theories. The reaction mechanism, though, is something that we can only guess at, and we usually guess at it from clues. We can then retroactively take a mechanism and test it against a rate law that we may have measured experimentally. But there's very little way we have of, predicting in advance what a mechanism might be. Now, I want to think about this in terms of energy diagrams. We've talked about energy diagrams a couple of times in the course, and you've probably recognized this one as one that we've seen before. Now, in a reaction diagram like this, we've pointed out that the activation energy is intimately related to the rate of the reaction. That's the height of the barrier that the reactants must go over to get to products. It's independent of the exothermicity or endothermicity of the reaction itself, and it really sets the tone for how fast a reaction can happen, and it's going to be a central player in our study of reaction mechanisms. But what happens if I have a more complex reaction? What I've shown here is a single transition state. That's a fairly simple reaction. Most reactions are more complicated, like this one here. Now again, I've got an exothermic reaction going from reactants to products, but I've gone through a number of steps to get there. And in fact, one of the things that we're going to pay attention to is how many transition states does one have to go through to get from reactants to products. And the more transition states there are, the more complex the reaction, and indeed, the less reversible that reaction may be in the end. Now, another way that we might think of this is that each transition state represents a different elementary step. So we can actually count the number of steps by counting the transition states. So on this diagram, for example, I might begin to draw boundaries around each transition state, and those boundaries then separate the three steps in this reaction from one another. This is one way that we can think about these reaction steps and these elementary steps, is that each elementary step corresponds to a single transition state. Now there's one more point that we need to make, and that is we're going to define a rate limiting step. And that's basically the elementary reaction in this sequence of reactions that is the slowest of all the elementary steps. And in fact, it's the slowest because it has the highest barrier that it has to go over. Now, I haven't specified that in this particular picture, but one might guess that it's the very first step that would be the rate limiting step, although the barriers for all of the steps are actually quite significant. Okay, we'll be learning more about reaction mechanisms as we go through this module.